Welcome. Welcome to this seminar. Great to see so many of you. This seminar on climate security, rethinking African-European partnerships amid crises. My name is Lars Engberg-Pedersen. I'm a head of research unit here at DIIS, and I will moderate the session today. And this session or seminar is the product of a policy study undertaken by Jakob Dreyer and Louise Wiuff on this issue, climate security. And you can see in the invitation also two products, a policy brief and a working paper, which you can find on the internet, and the brief is also printed, so that should be possible to get also. We have a dense and very interesting program ahead of us with a lot of very knowledgeable speakers, and I will introduce them when we get to them and not be lengthy here in the beginning. And just leave the floor to Jakob Dreyer, who is a researcher at Copenhagen University and also a project leader in this field. So, Jakob, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Perfect. All right, so first of all, I just really want to thank all of you for taking the time to come here late afternoon on a cold February day. That's highly appreciated. And also especially, of course, thanks to all of our guests and co-speakers who've come from abroad to this session today. It's really exciting to be a part of. So thanks so much for that. At the risk of being a little bit navel-gazing, I'll just very briefly talk about myself for the next 30 seconds. So my work focuses on how global warming impacts international politics and especially international security. A few weeks back, I handed in my PhD thesis, which focuses on European external relations in the field of climate and security policy. And I'm about to embark on a postdoc at the University of Copenhagen, which focuses on global climate policy, especially relations between European and African countries. And the reason why I think that this issue that we're going to discuss today is highly timely is that on the one hand, we see a surge in focus, in strategy papers, in memos, presenting, reflecting, analyzing relationships between climate change on the one hand and then security dynamics, conflict on the other. So from one end to the other, we have we've seen the UN climate security mechanism. The EU has recently developed and also published its own climate security strategy. Even NATO has developed a climate security strategy. But also, and I think that's perhaps an even more important point, we've also seen what I would call a degree of backlash against this way of conceptualizing relationship between climate change and security. Interestingly, if we look at the African Union, we don't often see a climate security framing of the challenges that the continent faces as a consequence of climate change. Rather, we increasingly see the use of concepts such as climate peace and security, climate and resilience, and an emphasis on climate change sort of being not only a challenge but also an opportunity to ensure long-term economic and social development across different contexts. So to sum up, it's important, but it's also witnessed a degree of backlash recently. And if we look at the African continent, the context is, I would say, and also based on reports from the UN, is a little bit bleak. So on the one hand, the African continent has contributed only, or made it about 4% of historical greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, some of the world's most climate vulnerable countries are on the African continent. At the same time, we see a massive gap between the adaptation needs on the continent and then, on the other hand, what funding we're actually witnessing at the moment. For instance, if we look at adaptation, the UN estimates that we have a 10 to 18 times greater financing need than what's currently being provided. And if we look at the recently supported climate loss and damage fund, we've seen funding of less than $1 billion, which is less than 1% of the needs that we have now, and a need that will only increase in coming years. And we see that poor and marginalized groups, especially women and children, are those most affected by these changes. That's the bleak context. But then also, I think it's important to stress that there are also some very promising developments on the African continent regarding the climate, peace, and security development. So we see a surge in African agency in development in agenda setting that was witnessed at what was called the African COP27, where the recently mentioned Lost and Damaged Fund was finally agreed upon. We also see the African Union's Agenda 2063, which tries to incorporate climate action into broader economic development on the continent. And then lastly, the Nairobi Declaration, where Kenya hosted an African summit where there was a broad agreement on a common African agenda to boost action and increase support for climate adaptation, loss and damage, not only in the UN system, but also more broadly. So we see a lot of developments where increasingly we see African countries taking, sort of setting the agenda and really sort of shaping international politics on this issue. And then what are the messages from our African partners? Of course, it's extremely important here to stress this, that I mean, the African continent is diverse. It consists of more than 60 countries. So, of course, this is a generalization. But at least if you look at the Nairobi Declaration, what we saw is that there is a willingness and even a demand for ensuring a greater African responsibility and leadership in finding solutions to climate-related challenges in the context of adaptation, loss and damage, but also in wider demands for ensuring greater economic development and a greater degree of justice on this issue. And an emphasis on the need for not just funding, but new and additional funding. So what we've witnessed, and that's been a cause of major backlash and critique, is that a large degree of the funding for climate action that we've seen on the African continent has not been new and additional, but has been taken from other development funding sources. And that's been and remains a source of massive critique and backlash. Then secondly, there is a major emphasis on the need for contextual approaches that sort of reflect the massive differences that we see across countries on the continent. So as I mentioned before, Kenya is in a very good position to thrive in and develop a green economy with, for instance, massive resources of thermal energy and strong ties to the West. But if you look at Kenya's neighbors, Tanzania and Uganda, for example, they don't have the same access to alternative energy and don't have that same close tie to Western partners. And it's important to find solutions that sort of are able to embrace and take into consideration these different contexts when we develop and improve partnerships across between European and African partners. And then fourthly, there is a growing emphasis on the need for finding local solutions that, especially in context or areas that are hit by violent conflict, really sort of find local and community-based solutions. Because what we see at the moment is that the communities that are hit by violent conflict and actually need this funding the most are some of the communities that get the least support because it's difficult to get there and to really meet the needs of those people. And the reason why this is interesting to talk about and discuss in Denmark in February 2024, in my opinion, is that Denmark is both sort of trying to take a leading role in the area of climate diplomacy, global climate policy. And Denmark is campaigning for a seat in the UN Security Council, where the hope is to bring and elevate security, climate, peace and security agenda on the Security Council. Denmark will also take over the EU presidency in 2025 during the very important COP30, which will take place in Brazil, where a key goal will be to improve and increase momentum for climate action globally. So Denmark has and could take a key role in this agenda, but the question then is sort of how can this be done in a way that is based on principles of equality and in a way that will successfully ensure that we will be able to build partnerships between Denmark and its European partners and its partners on the African continent. And here, the policy brief that I've recently published has 3 main arguments. The first argument is that international climate security partnerships on the African continent should be based on, rather than replace, long-term economic development. So if we want to ensure that these partnerships are lasting and strong, we have to, not just from the side of Denmark, but also from global north more broadly, we need to ensure that demands for new and additional funding are met. Secondly, we need to find solutions that are based on local ownership, local leadership, and that really sort of take a contextual approach and take seriously the needs, but also the knowledge of local communities. And then lastly, and perhaps most controversially, we have to find ways to meet, or at least find compromises on demands for greater global or climate justice, which is related to climate finance in a narrow sense, but also broader demands about the broader organization of international financing, debt relief, representation in international institutions, because only, at least my argument, and also based on interviews with many actors in African diplomatic circles, only by meeting those demands and finding the right compromises will Denmark, along with its partners, be able to develop and strengthen these partnerships on climate peace and security in the future. Those are my main points. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jakob. And thank you for being so much on time. What a wonderful thing for a moderator. Yes, we go on to the next presentation, and we take all the presentations and then open up for questions and discussion at the end. The next one is on climate, peace and security at the United Nations and at the African Union, similarities and differences. And this is Cedric de Coning, who is a research professor at the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs. Please, Cedric.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here with you. Thank you for your interest in the topic. As mentioned, I'm at the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs. I'm also a senior advisor with the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes. And I'm originally, and still am, South African, but now also Norwegian. So I think I bridge a little bit both in our topic today, both the African continent and the European and international continent. And I've been asked to talk a little bit about the differences and similarities between the United Nations and the African Union when it comes to this topic of climate, peace and security. And maybe by introduction, I should say that together with our colleagues from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, we have been involved in providing research support to the government of Norway whilst they were on the Security Council in 2021, 2022 on this topic of climate, peace and security. And we are continuing that support also currently for Switzerland and the Republic of Korea. So on the one hand, we are engaged in supporting these countries in their work on this topic at the Security Council. And on the other hand, we are also working very closely with the African Union in helping them to develop their policies in this area. At the moment, the African Union is developing a common African position on climate, peace and security during the course of this year. So it's on the basis of that work that we are involved in that I can maybe try to share a few ideas with you. First of all, what is climate, peace and security? And how does that differ from the work that we are doing in climate mitigation and climate adaptation? I think this question lies at the core of many of the debates in the United Nations and at the African Union, and helps us to perhaps also understand a little bit the differentiation between these two institutions and systems, the United Nations system and the African Union. When we talk about climate, peace and security, we are really focusing in on the effects of climate change on peace and security. So we're not talking about the effects of climate change itself, which of course is, long-term changes in terms of temperature and precipitation. but the negative effects that those changes may have on societal stability, on social cohesion, and so forth. And these negative effects, if you like, we can trace them through a number of pathways. First of all, if you are a society that is essentially dependent on rainfall agriculture, then you would be very vulnerable to climate change. And it means that the effects of climate change at its core affect or disrupts your livelihoods, your food security, your water security. And that could then have knock-on effects in terms of social cohesion and social stability. Ultimately, it could be about, competition or conflict even over scarce resources. But there are also very many other factors at play. And this is the other, I think, very important thing to consider, that when we talk about the effects of climate change on peace and security or on conflict, it's important to realize that climate change is never the only factor that is contributing to tension or to conflict, and very rarely is even the primary factor, right? It's more an underlying factor that exacerbates the tension that a society or a community experience when it comes to securing their livelihoods or other issues. And then in that process of adapting to climate change, there would be many other political and economic and other factors that can play a role in how that society or community responds to climate change. In most cases, when our societies, and we all have just gone through COVID-19, we have that shared experience. In most cases, when our societies and communities are under this kind of pressure, we tend to cooperate. It's only in rare instances that we would choose to compete, and actually in even rarer occasions that we will maybe choose to use violence to pursue our interests, right? So we are talking about a very small fraction of overall the number of cases, if you like, where climate change may affect and socially disrupt a community, where it could lead to violent conflict. But when you work with the United Nations Security Council, unfortunately, those are most of the cases on the agenda of the United Nations Security Council, right? So if through that kind of prism, most of the countries on the agenda of the Security Council are also heavily exposed to and vulnerable to climate change, and climate change plays a role in many of the countries on the Security Council. Through our project, we have looked at a number of countries in Africa, like Somalia or the Democratic Republic of Congo or Mali or Ethiopia, but we've also looked at countries like Afghanistan and Iraq and Colombia, and in all these different cases across the globe have traced the available research on how climate change and conflict is interlinked in these different cases. Now, when we want to look at the difference between the United Nations and African Union, perhaps one difference to highlight is that there's a much more tense or controversial debate going on in the United Nations Security Council about this topic than, let's say, in the African Union. First of all, let me take a step back and say, when I say the United Nations or the African Union, we're talking here about very broad systems and institutions that cover everything from human rights to development to climate change to peace and security. So in the United Nations, for instance, we have one particular body, the United Nations or the UNFCCC, that manages the implementation of the Paris Agreement through the COP process. And that's the body that has the main responsibility for dealing with climate mitigation and climate adaptation. But when we talk about climate, peace and security, that is something which is mainly discussed within the United Nations Security Council, because the Security Council has the mandate for maintaining international peace and security. So going back to where I started about what is climate, peace and security, it's not about climate mitigation and adaptation, which is being managed through the COP process and the UNFCCC and the UN system, but it's about the effects of climate change on peace and security, which is in the responsibility of the Security Council. But as I mentioned, there is a debate within the Security Council on this topic, A number of countries, especially Russia, China, India, Brazil, is very strongly opposed that the Security Council should be dealing with climate change at all. They feel that the climate change, well, I would say they have three main arguments. The first argument is that the UN should stick to its division of roles, and climate change should be dealt with by the COP process and the UNFCCC, not by the Security Council. And secondly, they fear a securitization of the debate. They feel climate change is something that is a social, developmental issue, and it should not be dealt with by peace and security instruments. And lastly, they also highlight, and this is one of the interesting things, that this debate, the scientific debate about what is climate, peace and security and what are the causal dimensions, what is the relationship between climate and conflict, is something that is also featured at the level, the highest diplomatic level at the Security Council. There are debates, or the diplomats put forward scientific evidence for whether this field has enough scientific backing for some countries in the Security Council to make this argument that it should be on the agenda of the Security Council. So although these countries that I mentioned are against this debate, the vast majority of the other members of the Security Council and a large portion of the general membership of the United Nations believe the Security Council do have a role to deal with the peace and security implications or effects of climate change. So the everyday work of the United Nations Security Council, when they deal with, for instance, renewing the mandate of the United Nations mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or sending a mediator to deal with the political turmoil in Sudan, all those tasks that the Security Council gives to its instruments, many of those mandates contain language that relate to the security, that relate to climate, peace and security. So for instance, tasking a mission to improve its analysis of climate change and how that affects the conflict in the given country, or tasking a peacekeeping operation with making plans for how they can ensure that, for instance, flooding will not affect their ability to carry out their mandate to protect civilians. So these are the kind of language, growing number of products in the UN Security Council that we see is adopted by the Security Council. But when the Security Council tried to adopt a resolution, what we call a thematic resolution, so not a country-specific resolution, but a resolution that generally acknowledges the importance of this topic, that resolution was vetoed by Russia in December 2021, and India also voted against, and I think China abstained. But the rest of the members of the Security Council all voted in favor, and 122 other member states co-sponsored that resolution, which was the second highest number of co-sponsoring states for a Security Council resolution in the history of the Security Council. So it shows that there is this vast body of interest and support for the agenda, but some countries are highly opposed. In the African Union, we don't see the same debate raging. The countries generally in the African continent, and especially in the various bodies that have adopted decisions on this topic in the Peace and Security Council and what we call the General Assembly of heads of state, have been much more open to acknowledging the relationship between climate change and peace and security, and have adopted various decisions along these lines. And that's why, as I mentioned, the African Union Commission is now working on developing a common African position this year that they plan to present at COP29. However, there are countries in Africa, including especially, for instance, South Africa, that very much has the same opinion on this topic than countries like India and Brazil and China. And so it will be interesting to see how the process around this development of the common African position does proceed in this context. Maybe the last thing I want to just say by summary is that it's, I think, for us quite interesting when we also work at the country level. So at the level of the United Nations Security Council and the level of the African Union Peace and Security Council, there's this topic of climate, peace and security, and this debate in the UN Security Council around it. But when we go to the country level, So yeah, I'm talking about a country like Zambia or a country like Mozambique. It's quite interesting to see that the terminology they use at that level is quite different. They would talk about social instability or social cohesion. They won't necessarily talk about security. That is quite a term that elevates the debate for them up to something which means we need to involve the Ministry of Defense or something like that, right? So, but for them, it's more an everyday issue of how to avoid negative social behavior and how to deal with social cohesion and social stability. So I think part of what we're also working on now in our work is to explore different sets of terminology and understanding of what we call this field. What is it that we are really dealing with? So we don't get stuck in a diplomatic debate about terminology that could undermine our ability to actually work effectively in this field. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cedric. And thank you for stressing the point about the words that we use, which are so important. Now we turn to, if I can see right in my program here, climate security and youth. Yes, understanding impact and shaping responses. And here we have Katongo Seyuba, who is a research assistant in the CIPRI Climate Change and Risk Program. Very warm welcome. The floor is yours. Yes.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, perfect. So thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And also just riding on the trend that Cedric has set. I am Zambian with an African perspective and also living in Sweden for like 5 years. So I have one leg in the African context and also in the European context, and I hope I can contribute to this interesting discussion. And also thank you to Cedric and Jakob for laying the foundation on the topic, which in a way cuts down a bit of my talking points. So I'll just dive right into it. Oops, there we go. Okay, great. So I'm a research assistant at CIPRI, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and I've been working on the climate, peace and security file for about 3 years now. And in my opinion, and from the time that I began working on this topic in 2021, there has been growing evidence and discussions on the link between climate change, peace and security. Both evidence from the research field and also in the policy field, there's a lot of discussion that's going on and acknowledgement and recognition of this link. However, there's still some areas within this field that are underexplored. For example, how different groups experience climate-related security risks and what their responses are. And one area which I'm passionate about, and also one area that's underexplored, is the issue of youth. So the connection between youth, climate, peace, and security. And on the left side, this was in my earlier talking points about how does climate change affect peace and security, and some of the research that we're doing at CIPRI, and also together with NUPI, we have this wonderful comic that was led by Cedric. And it's an easiest way to try and understand the connection, but I'll skip this for now because Cedric gave a very good introduction on the topic. So my presentation is centered around two big questions. Number one is, why should we care about exploring the connection between youth, climate, peace, and security? And the second part of it is, how are youths responding to climate-related security risks, and how can we support youth initiatives in that sense? So to start with the first part of the question, why should we care and why should we explore this topic further, I'll give a bit of a background. First of all, what we know is that young people make up the majority of the population in climate and conflict-affected countries. The African Union estimates about 3/4 of the population. And secondly as well, we know that young people are highly vulnerable to climate-related security risks, and this is partly because of the existing vulnerabilities that also Cedric was making reference to, such as high unemployment levels among young people, lack of resilient livelihoods. Often young people are engaged in informal sectors or climate-sensitive livelihoods like agriculture, pastoralism, etc. weak state capacities, especially in conflict-affected countries, to respond to some of the challenges that these young people are facing, and also a general lack of participation and inclusion of young people in decision-making that surround issues that affect them. Now, in addition to the vulnerability and the demographic factor, the other reason why we should focus and why we should explore this topic further is because of, number one, the existing narratives that we have in the debate at the moment. So the narratives are dominated by, one, the issue of young people are highly vulnerable to climate change. The second part is young people being perpetrators of violence. And we have some references in the research that we see connecting young people because of deteriorating livelihoods, that young people are often lured to join armed and extremist groups, or in a way to adopt unsustainable livelihoods also that have an impact on climate. Second, we know that young people often, in response to worsening and deteriorating livelihoods, often migrate or are forcibly displaced. And also there's a connection, a conflict connection that emanates, though not a direct one, that emanates from effects of migration and displacement, especially in host communities. Second, third, there are references towards young people engaging in protests and riots to express grievances associated to lack of inclusion, mismanagement, and governance issues. Now, to just try to bring this home, why should we explore the topic of youth, climate, peace, and security? To begin with, we need to expand what we know. There isn't so much on this topic. We need to expand the narratives, not only focusing on the vulnerability and the narrative of young people being perpetrators of violence, but also recognizing the efforts that young people are doing both in the climate space and also in the peace building space. Something that I know that the Youth, Peace and Security agenda is trying to push for. And most importantly, in bold, though it's not very clear in terms of it being bold, youth or young people are not a homogeneous group. So this is not one big group, but often in research it's referred to as one big group. For example, within this youth and young people framing, there are different age groups. Different age groups who have different or might have different experiences on how they experience climate-related security risks and their abilities to respond to those risks. Second also is the issue of gender. Within the youth framing, we need to consider gender dynamics. So most of the studies on youth, according to UN Women, and conflict implicitly or explicitly refer to young men, with young women being vulnerable in the studies, and also young men as perpetrators of violence. So there's need to have this gender perspective within this group so that we can have a complete picture that can promote, one, inclusion and also accurate responses to some of the issues that they're going through. The other point is the need to consider other forms of identities and experiences. A large proportion of IDPs is also young people. We also need to consider experiences of people, young people living with disabilities. And in addition to all these things, like Cedric put it, the need to consider different geographical contexts, because certain countries are at different levels, at different stages of conflict, experience different levels of socioeconomic challenges, governance, etc. So there's need to bring out all these characteristics when we're studying impacts of climate, peace, and security on youth. And moving on, trying to look on the other side of the coin and drawing inspiration from a study that was conducted commissioned by the African Union Peace and Security Council on some of the roles and contributions of youth to peace and security, also trying to challenge or at least add on to the existing narratives of young people being vulnerable and being perpetrators of violence, trying to showcase some of the initiatives that young people are doing to contribute to the peace building field. It's a very, not so much of a long report, but there's a lot of information that's there. So due to time, I just listed a few things. So some of the existing initiatives that young people are doing to contribute to peace and also, on the other hand, climate action include young people fostering dialogue and interfaith exchange, young people helping to prevent radicalization and combating violent extremism, young people also tackling and countering hate speech and false information and use of social media in that sense, young people in some cases also helping out in facilitating humanitarian assistance, young people developing innovative ideas to support different forms of livelihoods and promoting food security to prevent conflict, young people, especially from the climate angle, supporting grassroots and community adaptation initiatives, young people at the forefront of sensitizing people on climate change, climate activism, young people promoting climate smart agriculture, and also in both the climate and the peace building field, there's a lot of young-led initiatives trying to promote gender equality. And lastly, and most importantly, there's also young people that are trying to contribute to peace on the topic. Now, despite the initiatives that these young people are putting up, they face numerous challenges. Challenges also that I couldn't entirely list on this, so I framed them as overarching challenges. And some of them are centered around limited participation due to structural barriers. Now, the structural barriers can be related to issues of lack of access to decision-making spaces, issues of education, and so forth and so on. There's also a very big part, I think, that Jakob talked about on issues of financing. Youth-led initiatives often operate with limited resources, some of it which is a group of young people coming together and putting up money, contributions to drive peace-building initiatives and climate action initiatives. For some youth-led initiatives that are a bit more organized, others are able to fundraise, but also at a very small scale. There's also limited capacity to work on the climate, peace, and security intersection. Now, this challenge was picked up in one of my interactions with a youth organization that's working on violent extremism in Addis. We had a discussion on the connection between climate change and violent extremism. And one of the things that came out of that discussion afterwards over lunch was like, oh, I actually didn't know that climate change can be an underlying factor that can push this, violent extremism. So it's in that moment, and some of them expressed the need to have this technical capacity to understand the climate space, despite them being very knowledgeable on the peace building side, to understand some of the issues within the climate space, to be able to connect the dots. And this is where we can also help strengthen that capacity to help them understand the intersection. And overall, there's a lack of a supportive policy environment. I know that we have the Youth, Peace and Security agenda and resolution, but how that is translating in practice, and most importantly at national level, is still yet to be known. And of course, we don't have anything yet on youth, climate, peace and security. So what do we do about it? Where do we go? The first thing is, because we know there isn't much on this topic, there is need to support evidence-based research on youth, climate, peace and security. There is need for us to strengthen what we know about the connection, what we know about this purportedly homogeneous group, and breaking down this homogeneous group to understand how different categories within that group experience and respond to climate-related security risks. The second, there's need to enhance youth capacities, both technical, to help them understand the connection, and also on the financial aspect to work on climate, peace and security. There's also need to facilitate peer-to-peer exchange on youths working on the peace building field and also youths working on the climate. There's need to bring these youths together to see if there could be any synergies and any discussions that could spur work on climate, peace and security. And also there's need to institutionalize youth participation. I know that there are some commendable efforts both at AU and UN level. For example, we have the AU envoy, youth envoy, the UN youth envoy. We have the UN Secretary General Youth Advisory Group. We have the Global Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security. We have some of these initiatives, but there's need to do more to institutionalize youth participation, especially beyond this UN, AU, and also trickling it down to national level. And finally, we need to anchor all these ambitions within something, right? So there's need to promote an agenda on youth, climate, peace, and security. Do I see us having this agenda in the immediate term? My honest answer would be no, because of ongoing debates and discussions on the topic. But where my hope lies is that there's a possibility to include climate, peace, and security consideration within, for example, existing frameworks like the Youth, Peace, and Security Agenda. At the UN Security Council level, there's no mention in the current resolutions on YPS of climate, peace, and security. But at AU level, there's this ambition. For example, the last AU Peace and Security Council thematic session on YPS made reference to the need to enhance capacities for youths to, one, anticipate and address climate change as an emerging threat to peace and security. So already there within the African Union, we see a window of opportunity. We see a home where we can at least push our efforts to support capacity, research, and all these things within that framework. The other part of it is the need to include in the existing climate action efforts, the need to include conflict and peace consideration in order to make sure that climate action is conflict sensitive and does not exacerbate conflict risks, especially in climate and conflict affected countries. So I end here with hope that we can continue this discussion and move this forward, because this is very important, not only to me, but of course, as I laid out, we have the demographic factor where youths are the majority in population, and at the same time, we can leverage the efforts that the youths are doing amidst the challenges that they face and amidst the current space that they're operating in. Thank you very much, and I hope I was on time.
Thank you very much. You were sure on time. That was excellent. And thank you for highlighting youth, peace and security, alongside perhaps also women, peace and security in this discussion of climate, peace and security. I think they overlap a lot. Now we go on to Louise Wiuff Moe, who will talk about the Horn of Africa and advancing the climate, peace and security agenda. Louise is associate professor at Roskilde University, the Institute Department of Social Sciences and Business. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Does it work? Can you hear me all? Yeah, great. Yeah, great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks for the interest. So I will introduce some of the key findings from this study on climate security that has just been published, that Lars mentioned, a working paper. And there's actually a lot. I can see there's a lot of sort of synergies also with what Jakob has talked about, what Cedric has talked about in particular. So it is a paper that reflects in particular on the Horn of Africa, as Lars said, but also draws out some wider considerations on how to advance the climate security agenda, in particularly in contexts that are affected by conflicts and sort of institutional fragmentation. Let me just move the points on. Yeah. So the key focus on the paper is on how to direct the climate security agenda towards addressing interconnections between climate change, security, and peace, where we kind of consider peace as a continuum that also covers prevention, peace building, and also development aspects. So it speaks to some of the kind of key current debates that also takes place at the UN level that Cedric talks about, and also among regional organizations in Africa. And it calls for an outlook on security that also takes account of matters such as food and livelihood insecurity, loss of land and soil degradation, displacement crisis, very rapid urbanization, as they are some of the key underlying matters of insecurity that also are at stake in conflicts that are impacted by climate change, as Cedric also talked about. The study is divided in two main parts. So the first part assesses some of the wider gaps that are evident in current sort of policy and donor dynamics in the field of climate security. And then the second part focuses on concrete challenges and opportunities for addressing these gaps. And here I focus on the Horn of Africa, also for providing kind of more grounded recommendations and concrete examples also on climate security support in a context that is also shaped by conflicts. For the first part on this kind of the broader context and the gaps, it's clear that climate security has really sort of gained a recognition among prominent international actors and organizations that operate in the fields of security and defense, ranging from NATO, AFRICOM, the EU's CSDP missions, and of course also the UN. But there is still a sort of substantial journey ahead in really advancing a climate security agenda that integrates sort of longer term peace and development needs, and also related to these human insecurities that climate change generates. And I think to move forward this agenda also at the level of implementation, it is important to also sort of look at support for climate adaptation and climate finance actually as aspects of contributing to peace and security, right? And here there are some gaps that remains. Global North countries have struggled to live up to climate finance commitments, and also within a wider sort of international context with tense geopolitics, with competing priorities and so on. We have now seen some progress at the COP, particularly in regards to establishing this loss and damage fund, which is very important. But it's part of a wider set of issues, I would say. And it is really important to also support adaptation, because otherwise the bills for loss and damage will just continue to go up, right? And there is really a need for also giving priority to countries that are affected by conflicts. Recent numbers show that out of the countries with the highest vulnerability to climate change, more than half of them are also affected by conflict. But because of donor risk aversion and competing priorities, conflict-affected contexts, they receive very limited support for adaptation. It's more kind of like emergency measures focused on humanitarian support and kind of like stabilization, hard security, right? That kind of prevails in these contexts. So for the first part of the study, I have just picked out a few of the key messages here. So these two first bullet points here, they speak to sort of a key argument for advancing a climate security agenda that extends beyond traditional security solutions and focus really on positive security, peace and development outcomes for populations and regions that are the hardest hit by climate change. And that also means that climate security discourse should not like divert resources from climate finance to security mandates, but on the flip side, recognizing climate as a security issue can maybe serve to enhance commitment to climate finance and adaptation. And that, of course, requires coordination also across, as Cedric says, the UN is a quite sort of complex system with a lot of agencies involved here. So then the last message here speaks to another key argument, which is that advancing the climate security agenda and addressing these gaps regarding adaptation and climate support to adaptation and climate finance that it's really important sort of as entry points for the current prospects for forming partnerships in Africa. We see a context where there's sort of growing geopolitical competition, which means also that there are like a lot of actors out there seeking partnerships and alliances, right? And there is a climate justice discourse on the rise. So committing to really addressing climate insecurity and sort of taking account of local and regional priorities and needs, I think is really matters ethically, but also strategically, right? I'm unpacking that a bit more in the paper, but for the discussion here, I will move on to the second part of the study, which focuses on sort of concrete challenges and opportunities for advancing the climate security agenda, where I focus on the Horn of Africa. And this part of the study draws on interviews and conversations with officials from international and regional organizations, and also includes some case studies, including from Somaliland, because I'm doing a project there, the NIDA-funded project with partners in Somaliland. So it also draws on that. So it's kind of the choice of the Horn of Africa is both because it's where I have my key expertise, but also because it is a region that on the one hand illustrates the challenges that arise from these interactions between climate change, conflict, political fragmentation, but it is also a region that has a really long history of facing and adapting to really harsh climate conditions. So there is some grounded knowledge there and efforts to really like build on. The section first discusses the second part of the paper first discusses the challenges that the Horn of Africa is facing, including this kind of mutually reinforcing effects between political and institutional fragmentation, and then the lack of representation in climate change debates, including around climate finance and support for adaptation. It is a region that quite clearly illustrates this wider pattern that some of the contexts that really are the most exposed to climate impacts and where those impacts are combined with impacts from conflict, fragmentation, that they're also the context that receives disproportionately limited support for adaptation and that really struggle to access climate finance as well. The study also highlights, however, that regional actors have really demonstrated quite significant leadership and initiative in taking the climate security agenda forward. Now, Cedric has already talked about the African Union, so I think I'll just go on to talk about, specifically for the Horn of Africa, IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is a significant regional organization for East Africa and for the Horn. And IGAD was actually founded in the 80s as an intergovernmental initiative specifically for addressing droughts and natural disasters. So it has this really long-standing grounded knowledge on climate impacts, and it has established a number of mechanisms, including a climate prediction center and recently a climate security coordination mechanism. And IGAD's work also provides examples of quite sort of context-specific frameworks. It was highlighted earlier today that these like building on these regional initiatives and knowledge is quite important. For example, they have established frameworks for supporting pastoralism as a central aspect of their climate security agenda. Pastoralism is a really crucial livelihood and economic pillar for the region, and really badly affected by climate change, but generally also very underrepresented in climate adaptation debates, and also receives very limited sort of targeted support. So the point here is that while the challenges of institutional fragmentation and conflict dynamics, these challenges are very real, but there is some quite important grounded knowledge and expertise and initiatives to build on and partner with. I round off the study with some key messages on issues to consider when engaging in climate security support in contexts shaped by conflict and institutional fragmentation. One observation here is that climate security it has priority. In the Horn of Africa, people have first-hand experience of the insecurity implications of climate change. And there is also an awareness of how security discourse can be kind of part of elevating political awareness to the matter of climate change. I'm including a quote here. That's a quote from an interview with IGAD. It was a bit interesting. You also talked about it, Cedric, with this kind of political leverage that comes with security that can both be, there are different perspectives on that, but I experienced that there's also this sort of, that it can actually be leveraged to also draw attention to climate change as something that needs political action, right? But again, regional priorities extend clearly beyond this kind of hard security concerns. There's a really strong emphasis on issues of food insecurity, loss of livelihood, as I said, land degradation, displacement, and also this kind of really rapid urbanization and lack of capacity to really respond to it, which of course need not just containment, but kind of longer term responses. And that takes us again to this need for really connecting climate security to adaptation, to climate finance, to sustaining peace. And there is an overlap here, I think, with the UN approach, where recent discussions also really give attention to connecting climate change adaptation to sort of a peace continuum, covering also prevention, peacemaking, and post-conflict development. And I'm including a case study in the paper on how UN, in collaboration with national and regional authorities, have quite concretely worked with this approach in the context of the UN's political mission in Somalia, and under the umbrella of the UN climate security mechanism. I think this case is also kind of interesting in showing that how, despite this 21 veto that Cedric talked about, where the climate security resolution was vetoed in the UN Security Council, UN has still managed to kind of include climate aspects into mandates at mission levels, right? And it's also worth mentioning that the UN Peacebuilding Fund has indicated plans for kind of more risk-tolerant funding mechanisms that can support engagement in places like Somalia. And the fund has already some projects which have shown how support to natural resource management can actually be linked to quite significant peace dividends at the local level. It's important to say that these projects here also really, they have also shown they do face significant risks and all that, so it's not easy, but I'm just saying there are some encouraging results. Then the second, can see I should speed up a bit. The second message or consideration that came out is that it's quite important to try to couple adaptation to institutional capacity building. To the extent possible, it really matters for sustainability. It is both important and challenging, particularly in context where the authority and institutions of the state are fragmented or challenged. But otherwise you see this kind of self-reinforcing dynamic where institutional weakness and donor disengagement perpetuate each other's, and that kind of hinders sustainability. That's what this quote speaks to. Then the last key message here is to kind of flag that climate finance and support for climate finance, climate adaptation really needs to be made more flexible and accessible. I believe there's a task force working on that now, actually, at the UN level. But top-down bureaucratic regulation of climate finance is a quite significant obstacle for advancing and grounding the climate security agenda in contexts that don't have this kind of strong state and strong financial institutions. So it's both about making sure to deliver, but also about making the finance approaches and reporting requirements more flexible. To illustrate these points, and then I'm ending, about the importance of engagement that support existing capacities and allows flexible funding arrangements. I include case studies from Somaliland that draws on this Danida-funded research project that I'm doing with partners in Somaliland. It looks at kind of best and worst practices related to drought and related displacement and conflict dynamics. And in terms of a positive example, we include an example of land and grazing restoration project that has been supported by the Somaliland authorities and became quite a lifesaver for a number of pastoralists during the recent droughts. And there are efforts to expand this in collaboration with local communities. And it also has some relevance for this discussion of climate finance because it was supported through something that's called the Somaliland Development Fund, which is an example of a flexible mechanism for finance in a context where you have a state that is not recognized and where, Somaliland thereby don't have really access to climate finance and to a lot of sort of development finance. But through this mechanism, this was possible. So I'll end here, and there are more like examples and elaborations in the paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Louise, very much. And thank you also for providing an example of what I think Cedric talked about also, namely that positive cooperation is also a possibility in this field. So that was excellent. Thank you very much. The last presentation before the discussant is by Thor Olav Iversen, who is a senior researcher also at the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs, and he will talk about Trailblazers in a Warming World, the agency of African actors in climate, peace and security. The floor is yours.
Let's see. Thanks a lot. And thank you all for letting me borrow your attention for 15 more minutes before we open up for a more interactive format after. I will try my best to make it interesting. And also very nice to go on stage after a presentation that covers also very adjacent and synergetic topics. So thanks for that, Louisa. Let's see. So yeah, I'm a senior researcher at NUPI, and together with some colleagues I've written this research article called Trailblazers in a Warming World. It has recently been submitted to Peace Building, and it was sort of born out of a reflection that I made once I started in this field, because I'm quite new both at NUPI and in climate, peace and security. So I finished my PhD last June. Which was on statistics on food security, and then I started working at NUPI straight away, and went into the field of climate, peace and security. And I sort of noticed that across different sectors, so in diplomacy, like the fiercest opponents of climate, peace and security, like Russia, they will often say that this is a pure issue of post-colonialism and of Western exertion of power and agenda setting. I mean, as in the climate, peace and security agenda, and that is also partially how they have justified the veto of the resolution in 2021. But also on the research side, I've noted that there's been a lot, especially like 5-10 years ago, there was a lot of claims that climate, peace and security, it is a topic that sort of divides the world in a neat way, that you have the global north who are pushing the agenda, and then you have the global south who this agenda is sort of being forced upon. But having worked a bit at NUPI and a bit on this issue across the UN system and across the African Union, it seemed to me that this was a kind of assumption that it would be quite both meaningful and also in a way that could be meaningfully falsified, because there's a very strong agency of a wide range of African actors, which I will get back to. So I think the general dimensions of climate peace and security have been duly covered. This article we sort of situated within global international relations, so a subfield of international relations where there is an explicit ambition to center the narratives and the analysis and the agency of actors from outside the traditional Western world. And we also use, to challenge these conventional illustrations of African actors in international relations as passive and secondary, we use agency as a central analytical concept, trying to sort of make a bit of a bottom-up analytical framework for this case. And we ask both what kind of agency are African actors presently able to exert in the international system, not just concerning regional and national politics, but also international and global politics and issues, and also how this agency is enabled and constrained by the historical contingency. So there's both in a sense, like a possibility a space for exerting agency, but also structural historical constraining factors is a quick way to explain sort of the analytical framework. So over to the empirical review. Cedric also already touched quite a lot upon the dynamics of the UN Security Council, which you can see here on climate, peace and security. To give a very quick run through of or chronology of events. The first time climate, peace and security entered the agenda of the UN Security Council, that was in 2007. In I think an open debate hosted by the United Kingdom, who had the presidency at the time. And then there were some scattered events where climate, peace and security was brought onto the agenda of the UN Security Council until around 2015. And then from 2018 we see a strong that the agenda came on more and more in the Security Council, and and this sort of increasing attention, it sort of reached a crescendo with the tabling of this resolution by the sponsors Niger and Ireland in 2021, which was in turn vetoed by Russia, but also supported by 122 countries. So right there we have an example of an African actor who's been very central in perhaps the most pivotal moment of this agenda yet. Niger, who were very active both in sort of preparing the resolution and in laying the groundwork for it. But also we can look at more side events, both official events and side events at the UN Security Council, and we can find a very strong African presence across a number of African countries. The so-called A3, which is an abbreviation for the 3 African countries on the Security Council. And some examples of that that's for instance the ARIA formula, which are these informal debates in the Security Council, where I think African countries has co-arranged 5 out of 6 ARIA formula events on this topic. When it comes to open debates, African countries have also been involved in arranging all but one, and also been very active in the informal expert group, so-called, on climate, peace and security. And one of these events that I would like to highlight, which has a particular I would say relevance, both to this topic in general, but also to how we talk about this issue today, is ARIA formula meeting in 2022 by Norway and Kenya, where there was a kind of like a discursive engagement with the terminology used in this field, and pretty much a proposal to not only talk about climate security, which is very alienating to a number of countries and actors, but to bring in a peace element. So not to talk about climate security, but climate peace and security. And one of the rationales behind bringing peace on board is to sort of spell out, like several of the presenters have also talked about, that there's not only a negative risk with climate change. Environmental cooperation can bring peace benefits. We can, in general, like Cedric said, we can choose to cooperate in handling environmental issues, and we do so all the time. I mean, Norway still does common management of cod stocks, so fish stocks, with Russia, despite contacts at all other levels almost being frozen, for instance. And like also a previous speaker touched upon, there can also be, I think Louise said, there can be peace dividends, there can be perhaps benefits outside the strict area of environmental cooperation. So another actor which I wanted to touch upon is the African Union. So the same day that Russia vetoed the resolution in the UN Security Council, the African Union published a communique that indicated strong African support for the climate security agenda, both in general and also discussed a number of ongoing and future initiatives. So the African Union, like IGAD, has its own early warning systems for that are for climate change, that also aim to do early warnings on climate peace and security. They also have a prevention strategy on climate peace and security. And if you're sort of a bit into this field, you may also have heard that in December, the African Union published a continental risk assessment called Weathering Risk, that was co-authored with Adelphi, like a German think tank. So there's a very strong contrast in how this issue is handled in the UN Security Council and in the African Union, where support is much more ubiquitous. And also the African Union is in these days starting its work on developing a common position, a common policy position on climate peace and security, which at least I would say represents a major institutional innovation in this field. There is also, like Louisa covered, a lot going on the level below the African Union, so the level of sub-regional African organizations. And one organization is IGAD, but also the ECOWAS and ECAS, so the regional organization for Central Africa, and also regional mechanisms like the Lake Chad Basin Commission have also different kinds of policies on this issue, which we have found sort of in a way it's a trickle up, not trickle down, but to trickle up to the level of African diplomacy in the UN Security Council. Let's see. Yeah, and I'll have to be a bit quick, but Egypt, yes, Egypt introduced for the first time at COP27 climate peace and security as a topic in COP and the UN FCCC. Okay, so this broad involvement, it has included diplomacy, epistemic engagement, policy innovation. It's been very broad and multifaceted and comprehensive. So the explanations for this kind of agency is perhaps an issue that sometimes can be a bit controversial in many ways. Is sort of, are there logics of securitization governing this broad engagement with climate peace and security? We don't make any unicausal statements that the climate peace and security agenda is only moving ahead because of the agency of African countries, but The states that have taken leading roles in this field, they include democracies with proven track records of building democratic institutions like Ghana and Kenya, and the pre-coup Niger. And they also include countries from different language and cultural spheres like Mozambique and Gabon, and the list goes on. And are they following the donors? I certainly wouldn't suggest that donors do not have like an agenda-setting power, but the donor community has been fairly split in this question. The United States during the presidency of Donald Trump was not very fond of multilateralism in climate questions broadly, and let's see what will happen again this autumn. So our primary suggestion is that climate change is already affecting peace, conflict, and human security across the continent, and that this is an important explanation at the very least, not the only explanation, but an important one. And we also another interpretation from our side is that this centrality, which in this agenda, which has also involved a lot of mediation between, for instance, China and Western powers, it also indicates that the continent's growing geopolitical centrality is unbinding it from great power domination to a greater extent, and enabling African actors to exert a kind of non-alignment on their own terms, because the great powers of the global south, the India, Brazil, and China are sort of often on the opposite side of this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thor Olav. And now I'd be happy to introduce our discussant. And I was wondering, perhaps there was also an idea of moving the speakers up here in front while we have the discussant, who is Angela Muvumba Sellström, a senior researcher at Nordic African Institute. Now I'm looking at the... yeah, excellent. We take you should be over here, the ideas. Yeah, I leave the floor for you. And then perhaps our speakers could gather around the tables over there so that we can start a discussion when you have had a chance to respond.
Thank you very much. I don't know if everyone can hear me. Can you hear me? Is it loud enough? Very good. Toppen. I am an outsider to this conversation. I was introduced earlier. I am from the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala, and am really, really grateful for the chance, as a person who's worked a lot for over 20 years on women, peace and security in general, and worked with the AU, in the AU, with UN actors, with NGOs in Africa, and done research on a lot of different thematic issues. I've never done any research on climate, peace and security, or climate change and security. And I took up this offer because I think it's important that we all engage with this issue, whether or not we actually have great knowledge about the underlying dynamics or the scientific aspects of the issue, because it needs to be integrated in everything we do. So everyone agrees with that. And that's my way of actually getting out of any embarrassing comments that I make. So I'm going to allow myself to ask stupid questions of this really wonderful, esteemed panel. I really enjoyed your contributions, the way in which you were able to give us a whole range of knowledge about both the linkages between climate change and insecurity, but also about the different kinds of initiatives that have been ongoing and that are ongoing, and kind of opening up for us a little bit about future prospects for cooperation and for really embracing and tackling this issue. I'm going to give you a couple of questions. I'm going to start with a few observations, and then I'll just kind of ask you directly. And I might ask a few questions also based on my knowledge of how thematic issues are integrated into peace and security matters. As I said earlier, I worked on women, peace and security. I've also been written a study on, or co-written a study on Sweden in the UN Security Council, and led a project that's looked at other states in the Security Council. So I'm gonna try to bring some of that knowledge to bear. First, I want to say that you have, each of you in your own way, given us much to think about in terms of what we really want to call this issue. And I turn to Cedric, who said at the end of his presentation, it's perhaps time that we come up with new language, or a language that can kind of bypass some of the controversies around whether or not states actually want to engage with the climate change / security issue. So at various points in time, you talked about climate change, climate security, climate-related security risks, conflict and insecurity. None of you talked about climate shocks, which I thought was very interesting, because the climate shocks would have been, the big changes in weather that really stun populations with disasters. That was actually something missing. So I would like Cedric to propose, how do we actually get around this? Because it's very highly politicized. I also had some questions about different actors. And maybe after I ask this, I can turn to you all so that there's a little bit more dialogue. You disaggregated different kinds of actors. So the big disaggregation is between African and European actors, or global north and global south. But it's very clear from your presentations that certain governments, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, have a particular viewpoint. And they're very powerful, important economies. How would a country going into the Security Council or campaigning for the Security Council, like Denmark, really be able to kind of navigate the cooperation between the other countries, the other agents, that have been really proponents of bringing climate security issues into the Security Council, like a Niger, which co-sponsored the resolution that you're talking about with the UN Security Council. A small state, but very much has a moral ground because its population has been so heavily impacted by climate shocks and climate changes, environmental issues. And these big states that are really important trading partners, for example, with Europe, and play a very particular role in the new geopolitical order. So those are my two questions. They're not just for Cedric, but perhaps Cedric can go first.
Thank you very much, Angela. For somebody who doesn't know the field or hasn't worked a lot in the field, you're asking very direct and important and relevant questions, absolutely to the point. I think the climate, peace and security terminology is relevant for the work of, for instance, the UN Security Council and the Peace and Security Council. But when we work at other levels, I think it's important to also embrace and understand other terminologies, conflict resolution, social cohesion, etc. And I think we are, as Louise earlier said, on a journey. Field is fairly new, and I think we need to seriously engage with the further research to really unpack and understand how different communities would understand this field. What are the issues they are grappling with? What terminology do they use? And so we are actually embarking on a new project that specifically look at knowledge systems or understanding of this field at different levels, at the local level across the world, and then a different level. I won't go into a lot of detail, but basically what I'm saying is that this is not for us to come up with a new terminology. We need to, empirically see what terminology people are actually using to describe the situations they're finding and use that terminology in that particular context. Right. So again, just important, I think, for us not to impose another, concept from the global north or from Northern Europe, but to really unpack and work with communities and countries. On the BRICS, I think the argument is essentially informed by an essential distrust in the motives that the global north have with this agenda. They essentially believe that the global north is using this agenda to divert attention away from the key obligations that they have in the COP process and when it comes to climate finance and so on. So I thought Louise's argument that we should use climate peace and security as a way of leveraging political support for this agenda in a way that can actually increase climate financing and support for loss and damage, could be the point that I think that can address that kind of mistrust. If we can show that climate peace and security can be used as a way of actually leveraging additional political support for this broad field, and that doesn't distract from, but that contributes to the importance of leveraging climate finance and loss and damage, then I think it will really address this core mistrust that we are talking about. And then lastly, something that we are also doing in our project is I think it's important that the Chinas and South Africas and Brazils of this world listen to their own research, not just to us from the global north. And so in that context, we are working with researchers in these countries to also encourage and support them in their research so that more research is done, more knowledge is created within these own communities. Thank you.
Thank you. May I just note that Thor, you had a question, you had a response.
Yes, I would also like to add to Cedric's nice.
Yes, please. I think everybody should have a chance to take the floor and respond to these questions.
Yes, I think no one is probably going to be surprised that I think it's maybe a good idea to cooperate with the African countries. For Denmark, we are going into the Security Council, and I think that is sort of a bit about both the role that the African countries are assuming, both a bit in general in the peace and security and conflict field and in the UN Security Council, but also particularly in the climate peace and security agenda. And we, as I said, in our studies, we found that the African countries, at least senior diplomats, found sort of their contributions to be partially mediating between the Western donors, that sort of donor countries and countries that sort of support this agenda, and on the other side, their ability to speak to and enduring partnerships with the BRICS countries, including both China, I mean, especially China, but also Russia to some extent. So they have been leveraged to get through climate language, like Louise pointed out, at the country level to some extent, which, for instance, China has a stated policy that they are not opposed to country-level language on climate peace and security. So if a country expresses that this is their preference, they won't stand in the way. But we have also seen that African countries, for instance, when China was a penholder for a report on African capacity building in general. I think it was Gabon and Kenya and Ghana. They worked very actively in order to, and had very lengthy negotiations with the Chinese in order to get climate language also into that report in the UN Security Council. And then we also see that, for instance, with the recent peacekeeping or police operation in Haiti, that Kenya also played a key role. It's become more complicated eventually, but in actually passing a resolution where Kenya was at least originally supposed to send a police force to Haiti. So yeah, I think there could be a lot of potential there, and not only with African countries, but also the A3+1, so the island states, which are for obvious reasons also very concerned with this issue.
Thanks. Louise, would you like to?
Yeah, the mic is on. Yeah, I was just thinking. I mean, it's an answer that goes a bit in a different direction, perhaps, but with like the controversy around security, right? I mean, at least in academia, there's also a debate going on now about how climate crisis challenge us to think security different, right? Because when we think about security, it's already it's for someone, right? It is whose security. So a kind of challenge, and I really think this is sort of very generally when we look at climate crisis, it really pushes us to think about security beyond the state as the only reference, right? Obviously, you have human security, and I think that's what a lot of us have talked about here today also, but like in there's also now developments in like sort of ecological security, right? And how humans are also dependent on ecosystems, so the security of humans also depending on ecological security. And there's that whole, we just did a special issue on that actually, on how to like rethinking security in the age of climate crisis. So there's also that, right? Like whose security matters, right? And climate change really does not respect these state boundaries either. So it is pushing for a different conception of security, I think. And then I was just wondering, I found your answer interesting, Cedric, with the BRICS and this kind of like coupling to climate finance and so on also. And I was just like, I know that there are also some observers who have suggested that like vetoing could also be a way of actually avoiding that it would get that political like attention. And of course the BRICS are also like, it's also quite diverse, right? But I was just wondering if we talk about Russia and China, if it really would solve the problem, the suggestion of bringing that perhaps with South Africa, but I don't know. Because I mean, if that would be pushing for leveraging more on climate change, maybe taking emissions down, stuff like that, I wouldn't be so sure that like Russia and China would, that it would solve the issue there. Just, yeah.
Thanks. I think we should just take the round and then possibly come back to that question.
I have more
Yes,
questions.
precisely. Katongo?
Yes, please. What should Denmark do? I think it's important to engage non-like-minded countries. I think it's important to have conversations, constant conversations, to understand what their viewpoints and what kind of like, you know, what is stopping them from adopting this agenda. And through those discussions, I think there's a middle ground that can be found. You know, despite the veto, there's been a lot of progress that has happened within the Security Council. For example, the change of language. We're seeing a bit more language in certain mandates like South Sudan. So I think there's need to get back to diplomacy essentially and try to engage the non-like-minded countries. And then the second point is, I think it's important to look beyond the thematic resolution and try to look at smaller wins. For example, like the same example I would give on language in mandates. For example, support for climate peace and security advisors in the field, and having that process kind of feed upwards to the UN Security Council, supporting the climate security mechanism, for example, as well, so that, you know, this topic also is owned within the UN system as well. So there's a lot of smaller wins that can be explored by Denmark beyond thinking of the thematic resolution.
Thanks. Jakob?
Yeah, just a brief note. I really want to echo what Katongo just said. Engaging with, in any way possible, non-like-minded countries. And that goes for the Security Council, but also for Denmark's wider engagement on the African continent. We still have embassies, for instance, in Burkina Faso, in Mali, despite recent coups, and we haven't, at least until now, withdrawn our development projects there. So then we have to be creative about sort of how do we find either civil society actors or agencies that we are sort of willing and able to cooperate with despite a challenging geopolitical situation. Because I think there is a risk, that was also a point from my presentation, that of course we should run with Kenya when that's possible, right? But that can't be the only strategy. So I think we also have to find ways to engage with non-like-minded countries, either ideally with state actors still, but also, of course, if that's not possible, with civil society and other actors, with an emphasis, of course, on meeting security needs of those living in the states that have, for instance, just engaged or witnessed a coup, which they in no way were able to impact, but still sort of have to pay the consequences if we cut down or our support or entirely leave the country.
Thanks. Angela, were you satisfied with the answers?
Yes, of course, of course. I had a few other questions, but what I wanted to just give a little pushback. I don't want this to end on a very negative note, but I wanted to kind of draw some analogies to the Women, Peace and Security agenda and how that has been now in place for, it's coming up to its 25th year next year. And it wasn't really until 2016-17 that we started to see language on women, peace and security actually integrated into, like systematically, into UN Security Council resolutions. There was an emphasis on these thematic resolutions, the one similar to the thematic resolution that was just rejected on climate and security that was vetoed by Russia. So in a way, I almost want to say it's not a problem that we don't have a thematic resolution on climate change, because really what we need is we need it to be, as you said, in UN mandates and integrated. The other aspect I think that's super interesting is that women, peace and security is heavily criticized for being too top down, and very much criticized because it's very technocratic, meaning that people like myself and others in this room sit in the global north and we write policy papers, and the action that's taking place on the ground is invisible. So it's not actually getting well resourced. So I think it's very kind of positive that at this stage we're already talking about integrating youth and relying on youth and working out flexible ways of financing, and also on making sure there's research coming from the global south. But I thought it would be important now to maybe, based on some of these lessons, and I could go on about WPS, which is, there are some very, very dark critiques of these agendas, is that there's also this danger of when you securitize an issue, and I think this is what the debate could be. I mean, that's also part of the discussion here, that securitizing it in the UN Security Council creates what Louise's, this idea that there's a lot of elevation of an issue, it's very much talked about, but again, there's not enough progress on the ground. So I know that Jakob and Katongo both highlighted the importance of really capacity building and local level engagement. And maybe we could just kind of go back to that a little bit. And I would really ask, how do you see the connection between sort of community level action and national policies and the regional organizations that are there's this sort of line between these different levels. And it's a lot of research is kind of going around and debating, and I think that there's a lot of work that's now been done about the connection between the local and the top. But that hierarchy is still very, very troubling. So maybe I would just like to give you a little bit more time to talk about it again.
Yes, and I think
right.
that
And
is a
that's
key
it for
question.
me.
But on the other hand, we have also promised Q&A, so I would like to open the floor while you think about this very important topic. There may be others who would like to join in. Yes, I think you were first. You need a mic, I suppose. The people out there are concerned because we are streamlining, so people should be able to hear what you say. Could you present yourself also?
Of course. My name is Henrik. I'm from a company called Dalberg, and thank you first of all for a lot of insights. I had 3 questions. You don't need to answer all of them. I know there's many other people in this room, so you just pick one of them that you think is interesting. The first one is, right now the frame has very much been about climate change and security as far as I've at least seen it, in a local area where this become less stable, right? But if you look, for instance, at Ethiopia recently, they just took a decision to ban cars, right? And so that means that they're going to have many more electric vehicles and going to be solar panels, all good. But that could very quickly mean that they're going to be in the hands of China, right? If I'm Europe, is that something from a security point of view I'm actually interested in? So I'll be interested to hear from you guys, and I think you Louise, start expanding a bit, like this conversation, bring it into kind of how we understand security in the broadest way. So that's the first question. The second one is that a lot of conversation has been about financing, right? And what we know right now is that there's no financing for this, right? So the European countries, they all lack resources. So the idea that there's going to be a lot more money coming in for capacity building, what have you, not happening. So I'd like to hear from you, how do we deal with that issue? Like NATO right now, as we know, has a commitment for 2%. Is that something we need to have some hard public financing measures that are being in some way put through? Or is it more around private sector financing? If that's the case, when you talk, and this is to the first presentation, when you talk with the African countries, are they willing to make the changes in the regulation so you can actually invest in the countries? Because that's the big issue. The money sits in pension funds. They're not going to invest in these countries if they're not going to give some stable policy regimes. That's not happening today. And then the last piece is around youth. So if you look back, right now we think very much about angry men that has a weapon in Sahel, right? But the truth is, if you look socioeconomically, youth across the world is doing much, much better now than they did 10, 15 years ago. And when I speak with youth in Africa, this is not like high on the agenda. If you go to Denmark right now, you see a lot of youth that are concerned about the environment. They'll demonstrate, they'll change behaviors and stuff like that. But how do we mobilize the young people that actually have the resources in those places to take this serious? Because right now, this is not on the agenda.
Thank you very much. Those were many questions, so you will pick and choose and not answer all of them. There's a gentleman over there who would... Please present yourself.
Thank you. My name is Liam. I work for Corded, which is a Dutch NGO. I advise them on the triple nexus and humanitarian development piece and on localization. My question is whether you think or not that climate peace and security is going to be a catalyst for good in terms of changing the governance regimes that have been exclusionary in certain senses, also in the global north, around these issues. And so that there could be a momentum for having more unified positions on the need to address global systemic polycrises that we're faced with at the moment. Or not? Or do you think it's going to actually be the opposite, and there's going to be more kind of diverging opinions and groups fragmenting?
And we have one more over there.
There are two.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Rasmus Jacobsen. I'm the CEO of CARE in Denmark. Thanks a lot for insightful presentations, and I respect your calm. Could you maybe dare to take us to 2050? What would this agenda look like if we speed ahead a little bit? Sort of, what do you see when you look in the crystal ball? Thank you.
Yes, please.
Okay, thanks, guys. Florian Krampe, Director of the Climate Change and Risk Program at CIPRI. Great presentations. Thank you all. One thing that came too short for me is a little bit the evolution of framing, how it has evolved over time. And I think that is something, if anybody feels like and knows, to recap that. My question is more like to Jakob and I think Louise, and it's sort of, I think it came more or less implicitly or directly out in your presentations. And I don't have an answer to that. I find it an interesting puzzle and thought experiment. And it's around targeted and earmarked funding. And we are having these battles where we are fighting for very specific pots of money on all these issues. At the same time, money is shrinking. Areas are getting more complicated. We're essentially paying for 30 years continuous emergency humanitarian aid to Somalia, right? Makes you wonder if that is still an emergency or normal. But is that the way? Is the way to fight for targeted earmarked money, or do we need to have a fundamental shift in our thinking about development aid and these type of resources to actually allow flexibility and allow synergies? Because this is climate adaptation money. I can't use that for peace building, right? That is sort of discussions that are happening in the field. And what we need is like, how can I do peace building with climate adaptation?
Thank you very much. Many and very broad questions. So now it's up to you to pick some of the things that you would like to say in response to these issues. And I would urge you to remember Angela's point about the links between the different layers. That is, I think, very interesting. And as a moderator, I can emphasize something. Jakob, would you start this time?
Wish me luck. Yeah, so starting with Angela's excellent question, I think actually that is the issue that many of us, at least my new project, that's going to focus on sort of moving across scales from local energy transition opportunities and challenges in Tanzania and Uganda to the national level, to the East African level, and then think about relations between how mostly European or global North pressures on mitigation for good and bad, impact energy practices, funding, and consequently social and economic challenges and opportunities in those local contexts. So in 4 years' time, when I finish my postdoc, hopefully I will be able to provide a better answer. But I think at least sort of a very sort of initial and insufficient answer is that also as argued by Cedric as well, we need to be a lot more careful about and sort of pay a lot more attention to how these dynamics and how our assumptions about climate security are actually expressed and practiced on the local level, and be very aware as to not impose our understandings. And that's also why I think, for instance, the project that I'm a part of, I think it's so great to work with scholars at Makerere and St. Augustine, and with them conduct fieldwork at a local and a national level. I think at least that's the way forward if you want to find answers to that very difficult and challenging question. And I think regarding the question from Florian, I think one thing is having this as a sort of theoretical abstract discussion, right? But it's also a very policy relevant discussion because it's the demand that we increasingly hear from actors across the global south, right? This is not just about $1 billion more or less for a loss and damage fund. It's about climate justice in a broader sense, and there we see demands for debt relief, for a more equitable financial system, for changing it in a way so that interest rates are not as ridiculously high as they are for many African countries, right? So I think this is a very sort of relevant topical policy discussion that I think, and that was also the argument of my presentation, even if you disregard the justice dimension, I think if you're just a strategic actor in the global north, I think you have to find compromises and go further than we've done before to meet those demands. Of course, part of it will be through increasing private funding for these initiatives, and I know that also, for instance, Kenyang with France is discussing so far, because of BRICS opposition, not with any luck. For instance, raising funds from aviation and maritime taxing and stuff like that. So my point there is, I think this is going to be the agenda, and I think it will be the only way to the combination of broader structural changes and significantly increase of private funding will be the only way to meet the financing goals that will be discussed at the coming COP, and will be key in meeting the demands that we increasingly see.
Thanks. Katongo, please.
Yes, please. The question on how do we mobilize young people, very short answer is we need to create more forums that encourage peer-to-peer exchange. On the youth, peace and security side, I know that there's a global coalition on youth, peace and security. I also attended one AU youth event within IDOV is what they're called. But what strikes me when I sit in some of these meetings is that when you bring youths from different contexts, different spaces, the amount of exchange and the amount of knowledge that happens there is inexplainable, and there's a lot of potential and synergies that can be tapped from there. For example, here in Denmark, it could be as simple as organizing a forum, bringing youths from Africa, bringing youths from Latin America, etc., and then having these kind of exchanges. But some of these issues also need to be institutionalized so that they're not a once-off kind of an event. So I think there's an opportunity to try to encourage a bit more communication between different youth groups, and then a bit of learning from that end. On the issue of local going up and down, that's a very difficult question, but drawing inspiration from my presentation on the youth, peace and security agenda, I mean, it's great to have this big agenda like WPS, but it's also great to work outside it at the local level. So my honest opinion would be to find a way to work both at international, regional and national level, and also at the local level, more or less like in parallel, and trying to find ways that they could also, kind of both feed into each other, and that's so kind of focusing efforts on local, for example, like the youth trying to enhance capacities at local level, but also in a way trying to, bring up discussions at such forums and also UN Security Council level, etc. So I don't know how it can be done, but yeah.
Thanks. May I just add, it seems to me that there is a break in many ways, a break between the local level where climate, peace and security may not be the words that we actually find and hear and so on. And then at the national and international level, where those words may actually produce increased mobility and attention to these issues. So how do we translate between those levels? I think that is also a key question in this context. Louise, please.
Yeah. So maybe I will start with that, like level questions, and particularly like how to engage at the local level, how to sort of couple it up. I think it's really tricky, and also probably that's also partly because of the particular context that I do research on, like with the Horn of Africa, right, where you have also this, just on top of it, this big question on who do you engage with and partner with when the state is contested or fragmented and so on, right? And like, I mean, I would definitely be a proponent of like a kind of community and local level engagement. At the same time, I also sometimes see patterns where donors, because of risk aversion and not wanting to get involved in like contested politics, go directly to communities, sometimes with no anchoring whatsoever institutionally. And that's also not necessarily sustainable, right? So that can really create issues as well. So when I say institutional engagement, it's important to say I don't necessarily mean like state engagement, not necessarily, but it could also be like community institutions and so on, but that it has some anchoring, that it builds on something that is going on, that can sustain it, because you do have these kind of pre-ready projects that just go and do what they want to do. And it links to climate finance too, because often it will be like international NGOs who can access the finance, right? And then like define what, like how to use it. We had, so with the, I provided this positive example of this land restoration process in Arori in Somaliland, and we we actually sort of contrasted to another case of cash transfers, where you had unconditional cash transfers, which in many ways can be extremely important. It's an important humanitarian tool as well. However, it has become like a protracted thing where people have been getting cash transfers for up to 7 years and sit in IDP camps. The issue there being again that there's been no anchoring, no coordination, no, you know. So yeah, I think it is. I think the different levels, yes, and linking them up. I don't have sort of the answer, obviously, but I think it is very important to also, in places where institutions are fragmented, to then really do as much as possible in terms of trying to anchor in local initiatives and local institutions. Maybe very briefly on I think sort of your questions on how the climate, peace and security, what that might mean also for donors, and then Florian's question on this kind of earmarked money speak a bit to each other. I could have the hope, but I have no idea, right? But that this climate, peace, security agenda could be an entry point for some reforms that really need to happen both in development collaboration, but also in the domain of security, with, you know, more flexibility, different types of partnerships, all of that. Maybe that could be revitalized, and that is also a bit the flexibility you're asking about, Florian. But honestly, it's more something I would hope for than it's something that I could say necessarily will happen, right? Yeah, I think I'll just hand over to you.
Please, Cedric, take over.
Thank you so much. Really tough questions, and just to contribute to what my colleagues already said. I mean, maybe first of all, just to bounce back to our earlier conversation. I mean, we focused a lot about the debate in the Security Council earlier, because that's kind of what we chose and how we framed the discussion. But I think it's important to also look beyond that bubble. You know, the Security Council is important to set the tone, but there's a lot that is happening regardless of what's happening in the Security Council at the country level. And I would suggest that when it comes to the Security Council, these countries that we mentioned that are strongly opposed to the agenda, they are not going to change that. They also get agency from opposing the agenda. It makes them look good. It makes them powerful. So they are not going to give that up. What we've learned over the last few years is perhaps focus rather on the country contexts, also at the Security Council, but then especially at the local level. That's where it has more meaning. That's where it's important. That's where it has an impact. And I think there we need to spend much more time on learning and listening together with the communities, as we've said before, to see what works, what can be done different, and so on. So I think we need to be, you know, much more, I would say, pragmatic about learning from our experiences at the local level when it comes to this area. I think it was a really great question about looking forward to 2050. What the IPCC is telling us, the International Group of Climate Researchers, is that the effects of climate change are going to become increasingly serious. And so I think a lot of the things that are still kind of academic debates at the moment, by 2050 will be much more clear in the way they have manifested and also their impact on peace and security. So to that sense, I think, unfortunately, the reality will be stronger in our face about these conclusions that we are drawing, and therefore perhaps make action more clear as well. I don't think the climate, peace and security debate is some kind of a silver bullet that's going to, you know, give us the momentum to address the poly crisis. But I think, as we said earlier, there are many, many factors that are creating and driving the poly crisis. But it's one factor that we shouldn't ignore. Our analysis is weaker if we don't include the climate into that analysis. Lastly, on the finance, I think we are not going to see, you know, significantly more money. So we have to use the money that we have much more wisely. And integrate that better. I think we will see new instruments, we will see new innovations there. But ultimately, I think there's not going to be significantly more money to be completely revolutionize this field. And for me, that means that we need to focus much more on what we have. And with this, I'm thinking back, for instance, to the COVID-19 crisis. And I think of Africa, and I think that many of us as analysts have expected that we're going to see huge conflict erupting in Africa as a result of COVID-19. We're going to see thousands of people dying from poverty and on the streets. And we didn't see that because there's enormous resilience in the communities in Africa and in other places. And so I think people will find ways, regardless of climate finance or not, to support each other, to cooperate, to cope as best they can in that reality. Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to also touch upon Angela's comment about technocracy in the fields of women, peace and security and climate, peace and security. And I think in many ways, climate, peace and security is uniquely badly suited for a pure technocratic mode of governance and understanding. And that is because climate change on the one hand, the climate, and society on the other are often regarded as complex systems, which is a concept I won't go too much into. It's from system dynamics, but for our purpose now, it means that they are very difficult to predict. The output you get for the same input across time may not be the same. And in situations like that, we have society as complex and we have climate as complex, and this field is sort of situated in between. In context like that, science is less sufficient in itself because science relies on modes of predictions which are not very well suited to predict the future behavior of complex systems. So therefore we need all the knowledge that we can get from across science. We need interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinary approaches, but we also need all the relevant knowledge we can get from beyond science. So, for instance, if you want to like we have touched upon before today, if you want to say something about future transhumance and pastoralism routes in Africa, you really have to rely, for instance, on traditional and local knowledges. So, inclusive knowledge practices, it is crucial both in a democratic sense, that to take into account the knowledges and perspectives of vulnerable populations, but it's also crucial in an epistemic sense in regards to getting the best knowledge quality that we can have.
Excellent. Thank you. Good knowledge is always important. I'm sorry I have to cut you short. There were many more questions, but time is out. So I would like to say thank you very much to the speakers for excellent presentations and good discussion and excellent questions from you and spirits out there. So thank you very much.